For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 3739, the Presidential Allowance Modernization Act of 2017, as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 3739, a bill to amend the Act of August 25, 1958, commonly known as the Former President's Act of 1958, with respect to the monetary allowance payable to a former president and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Heiss, and the gentlewoman from Illinois, Ms. Kelly, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on the bill under consideration.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
I rise today in support of H.R. 3739, a bill I introduced to limit the allowances paid to former presidents. Congress passed the Former President's Act of 1958 to maintain the dignity of the office of the president and assist former presidents who did not have sufficient financial resources. It's a noble purpose, but times have changed. When the Former President's Act was passed, Herbert Hoover and Harry Truman were the only 2 living former presidents. Unlike the more recent former presidents, they did not earn millions of dollars from speaking fees and book deals after leaving office. For example, President Clinton earned more than $100 million in speaking fees between 2001 and 2013. President George W. Bush received $10 million for his book deal. In April 2017, President Obama spoke at a Wall Street firm for a fee of $400,000. And he and former First Lady also reportedly signed a joint book deal worth over $65 million. It is a fact that the modern presidency, that these lucrative financial opportunities are available now as they were not to former presidents. Because of these opportunities, it's no longer necessary to provide taxpayer-funded support to former presidents in the same way as envisioned in 1958. H.R. 3739 presents a fair way to reduce taxpayer support to those former presidents who no longer need such assistance. Furthermore, with our nation facing $20 trillion in debt, we must find ways to save taxpayer money, and our former presidents will lead by example in cutting costs under this bill. The Presidential Allowance Modernization Act reforms pensions and allowances provided to former presidents and surviving spouses and reduces unnecessary costs to the taxpayer. This bill sets a former president's pension at $200,000 compared to current law, where the pension is linked to the cabinet secretary's pay level, currently at $204,700. Surviving spouses of former presidents will be eligible for a pension of $100,000, a more realistic amount than the $20,000 pension available under current law. Currently, former presidents are also eligible for other benefits paid through annual appropriations. These include office space and leases, furniture and supplies, and staff salaries. Such additional benefits provided to former presidents totaled $2.84 million in fiscal year 2017 and $2.43 million the year before. Instead, this bill will provide a $500,000 lump sum allowance for each eligible former president to cover such expenses. This allowance will be reduced dollar for dollar for any earned income in excess of $400,000. For example, a former president making $900,000 in earned income would not be eligible for the allowance. For former presidents eligible for the allowance will decrease over time. 5 years after the former president has left office, the allowance is reduced to $350,000, and then 10 years later, the allowance is reduced to $250,000. In the 114th Congress, the Presidential Allowance Modernization Act of 2016 was passed, but it was not signed into law. Senator Joni Ernst and I have worked with other stakeholders to improve the bill in 2017. This 2017 bill advances the same principles of accountability and modernization as the 2016 legislation, but makes some key changes. First, the bill provides a 6-month period after the date of enactment before the bill takes effect to ensure current former presidents have time to plan for the changes. Second, the bill increases the allowance amount from $200,000 in the previous bill language to $500,000. However, as described earlier, this allowance decreases over time, but it is not entirely eliminated should a former president be eligible for the allowance. The office of the former president is an important institution to support in a nominal way. We were all recently reminded of the importance of this institution by the joint effort of former presidents to raise hurricane relief funds. The third change made in this version of the bill is the pension and allowance are terminated 30 days after the death of a former president instead of immediately upon death. This change was made to accommodate the work that must be done to wrap up the affairs of a former president. Finally, I want to assure my colleagues that this bill does not impact funding for the security or protection of a former president. Again, I want to thank Senator Ernst for her work on this bill in the previous years and this particular bill in 2017. It's been a real pleasure to work with her and her staff. I want to acknowledge members such as Mr. Cummings and Mr. Grothman and former Chairman Mr. Chaffetz, whose work on this bill last year positioned us to be successful this year. I also want to express my gratitude to the professional staff on the House Oversight Committee who have put in so many hours of work on this legislation. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentlewoman's recognized.
This legislation would amend the former President's Act of 1958 to cap a former president's annual pension at $200,000 indexed to inflation. The bill also would provide an additional annual allowance for expenses that would start at $500,000 per year and decrease gradually to $250,000. Under this bill, the annual allowance would be reduced dollar for dollar in instances in which a former president's adjusted gross income in a taxable year exceeds $400,000. Taxpayers should not have to pay for a former president's allowance if the former president is making a comfortable living, earning millions of dollars a year, as many former presidents do. This legislation would not affect any funding for the security and protection of former presidents and their spouses. This legislation would update the pension amount for surviving spouses of former presidents, which has been unchanged since 1958, by increasing it from $20,000 to $100,000. Last Congress, President Obama vetoed a previous version of this legislation because it would have unintended consequences. For example, due to technical drafting errors, it would have resulted in the immediate termination of the salary and benefits of certain staff of the former presidents. It would also have resulted in the termination of leases for office space and the removal of furniture and equipment. That was clearly not an acceptable situation. I'm glad we have been able to resolve these problems in the legislation before us today. I believe this bill makes fiscal sense and urge members to support it. Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman reserves. The gentleman from Georgia.
Mr. Speaker, I have no further speakers, and I'm prepared to close.
Gentlewoman from Illinois.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to give 3 minutes to the gentlelady from Washington, D.C., Congressman Eleanor Holmes Norton.
Gentlelady is recognized.
I thank my good friend from Illinois for yielding to me, and I would like to thank Representative Heiss, our own Chairman Gowdy, our ranking member Cummings, for including in this bill, like the similar bill from last Congress, an update to the former President's Act to reflect the positively changed status of the District of Columbia government since the enactment of the former President's Act of 1958. As it affects the District of Columbia, this bill provides an update to better reflect, to indeed reflect, the law regarding the District of Columbia as it is now, as opposed to how it was at the time the former President's Act was originally passed in 1958. In 1958, the District of Columbia had no elected local government. It didn't have any member of this body to draw this matter to your attention. Instead, the D.C. government was run by three presidentially appointed commissioners. All locally raised D.C. funds were deposited in the U.S. Treasury, locally raised, but put right there in the Treasury, and the federal government paid the employer contribution to the pensions of D.C. government employees. You can see how D.C. thinks of itself at that time as a colony of the United States of America. Well, we've changed all that thanks to the Home Rule Act, the work of this Congress. This bill would treat employment of former presidents and the widows of former presidents in the District of Government in the same manner as the employment of other local and state governments. The Former Presidents Act was intended to prevent former presidents and widows of former presidents from double dipping from the U.S. Treasury by collecting a federal pension during any period they were employed by the federal government or the D.C. government, just in case that happened. However, the Former Presidents Act became outdated with respect to the D.C. government after Congress passed the Home Rule Act of 1973, and it needs to be updated. The Home Rule Act granted the District of Columbia a locally elected government. Under the Home Rule Act, D.C. local funds consisting of local taxes and fees are deposited in D.C. government accounts, not the U.S. Treasury. Also, because of the Home Rule Act, former presidents and widows of former presidents would not be double dipping by collecting both a federal pension and a salary, not from the D.C. government, because they are funded by what is now different governments. Very grateful that the House passed this bill last year. This is, of course, leftover business from more than 40 years ago. While the District of Columbia struggles to become the 51st state, we appreciate that at least being recognized. Thank you for, I thank my good friend for yielding me another minute. While the District of Columbia struggles to become the 51st state, we certainly appreciate at least being recognized as a independent jurisdiction, no longer a ward of the federal government, as granted by the Home Rule Act of 1973. I particularly appreciate my friends from the Oversight and Government Reform Committee on which I serve, seeing that this bill came to the floor, Congressman Heiss, and I appreciate the leadership for placing this bill on this calendar, and I strongly urge the adoption of this bill. I yield back and appreciate the time.
Gentlelady yields.
And I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back the balance of her time. Gentleman from Georgia.
Mr. Speaker, I urge adoption of this bill, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields. All time having been yielded, the question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 3739 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.